All right, welcome guys to another episode of Express Outdoors State of Waterfowl series. If you didn't listen to last week, then you need to go back and listen to part one of our series with Delta Waterfowl and Ducks Unlimited. We are back from that conversation and continuing with some really good stuff in regards to public policy, farm bill issues, and a whole variety of things that evolve around the state of waterfowl. And so let me start off again by welcoming our special guest, John Devney, Senior Vice President at Delta Waterfowl, and Ed Penny, Director of Public Policy with Ducks Unlimited. And of course, we've got Kaysen Short from Bill Byers Hunter Club, and we also got Jimbo holding the fort down again here in Stuttgart. So thank you guys for being here for part two. And let's kind of pick up where we left off. And so, Kaysen, you actually had an interesting question we talked about during the break. Why don't you ask the guys a little bit about the cultural part of hunting?
We spent a lot of time talking about the natural resource earlier. You know, in our episode, we talked about wintering ground, we talked about nesting ground, rice production, green tree reservoirs. We did a lot of science stuff, but I had an interesting conversation with a friend about what we call the glory days of duck hunting. And a lot of us, I feel like most everybody on this meeting here will agree that, you know, the 80s and 90s were what we look back as the good old days. And it seemed to be a lot different for us back then. You look back at duck hunting as this cultural experience, and rarely did we all like to kill. Let's not kid ourselves, we're hunters. But I don't think we measured success as the same way as we do today. And maybe that's social media, maybe it's not. But culturally, do you guys think that we have done an adequate job passing on the culture of duck hunting?
Jimbo, what do you think?
And, you know, thanks, Ed. But yes, we have. I think we have. I think there's a whole group of people, and I know I've talked to all of you individually and said this same statement. I know Debbie and I have at length, but there's a whole group of people here. And just to be frank, we call them the class of 99. That if they could raise up and pull the trigger and shoot a duck and he'd go down in a ball of flames, they'd be happier than a cat on a flat roof. You know, and there's more to it than that. And I think we've missed something somewhere. Not that we don't have duck hunters and we need them. And I don't want to be against young guys who are wanting to enjoy the sport and be a part of it. But there are some heritage and traditions here that I think what Kaysen's getting at that we as a group hold dear. And we got to find a way to pass that on to some of these younger guys. I know what Kaysen's doing with his boys coming up, but there's some folks, young guys caught in the middle that haven't had that opportunity. And they'll watch, I'll admit to the guilt here, they're watching an RNTV episode and we'll shoot 8 limits in 17 minutes. Might have took 3 days to get all that footage put together, but they see it happen in, well, it's more than that. So it's 22:30. They see us shoot 8 limits of ducks or whatever, or a 3-day hunt might have been 35, 40 ducks killed in that short period of time. So they think that's how it's supposed to be every time. Quack, quack. We call it amongst us in the industry, quack, quack, cluck, cluck, boom, boom. Well, it doesn't really work like that, right? We all understand that. We're all duck hunters. But there's a misconception there that that's what it's all about. And we got to figure out how to make folks understand or realize that, one, we have to protect the resource. Without the resource, we don't, whether you're impassioned by it or whether it's your vocation or it's both, without that resource, it's not there to take care of us. So we have to, one, propel the resource. Two, we have to understand that there's a lot of heritage and tradition and culture that goes on with it. The why is not necessarily the how. It's the why we do it, and the tradition of why we do it needs to be as important as the how. So we've got to find a way to educate people or bring folks in to that understanding. And I think that will help with the boat racing, with the sky busting and everything else. And those of us in the outdoor media need to probably work together to find a way to tell that message to folks to where it's palatable. You know, a few years ago, we did a deal on RNTV with Dr. Mickey Heitmeyer. We was doing a habitat piece every week about bottomland hardwoods, about ducks, and about all kinds of cool stuff that I thought was awesome. I got a college education for nothing from it, but folks weren't. We didn't really pull folks in to that. We didn't package it proper. We didn't present it proper. So to Cason's question about the culture, we need to find a way to package that and present it to where we got more young people coming on. Because to Ed's point earlier, one of the most important things we can do to accentuate the resources, buy federal duck stamps. So we need people wanting to be a part in the right way, purchasing federal and state duck stamps, being Delta and DU members to help perpetuate the resource. So it all works hand in hand. And I could go on and ramble, but y'all get the idea. It's all about the resource first, and then whatever comes from that second. But it all works together.
Hey, Jim, just you made me think about something, and a couple of other guys may not know Grant Hillman, but he's a common friend of ours and
Yep.
big duck hunter. It's been all over the country. He actually has a houseboat down here and hunts right amongst our stuff here at Gros Savant. And he did a Facebook post Friday night because we've
Yep.
all been damaged by the hurricane. And he listed about 15 things in a Facebook post that he missed because the camp's no longer there. It's destroyed by the hurricane. And not one thing did it mention killing a limit of ducks the next day. It was about how I missed seeing my son at the camp on Friday night, miss eating a pot of ducks and having a drink with my friends. And when you start listing everything, it really had nothing to do with killing. It was all about the tradition it was missing. And I got to admit, I actually kind of teared up a little bit because I personally missed opening day this year for the first time in 40 years because of the hurricane with all that we were going on. So, we tend to overlook, what it's really about. And there's a lot more to it than just going out there and pulling the trigger.
Oh, guaranteed. Look, I like a full strap and the smell of gunpowder as much as anybody. I like to watch my dog work hard, but the bottom line, it's that culture and tradition that come together that make it what it is. I just come back from Oklahoma and was talking to some guys out there, and they got a pretty cool duck hunting resource, but the folks out there, there's not a duck hunting culture there like there is here in the Stuttgart area or the South Louisiana area or North Dakota, where people talk about duck hunting all the time. They out there, as I learned, come to understand, they just call all of us goose hunters. Well, them goose hunters this, them goose hunters that. I'm a duck hunter. I'm not a goose hunter, but I like to shoot waterfowl and I like to spec hunt. So regardless of all that, we're all lumped into it together. And the more people understand the why and how, whether you're cattle and milo farmer in Oklahoma or Kansas or wherever you're at, the more you understand the resource and the importance of waterfowl to us as a country, us as a nation, and our people, the better off we're going to be.
Yeah, kind of switching gears again, there's always these key words that keep coming up. And just in your conversation on heritage and culture, you mentioned the word resource about 3 different times. And here we go back to managing the resource. And that's kind of what this whole State of the Waterfowl series is about, is how do we manage the resource and what scientific information is out there that we have that we can use. So while we got Ducks Unlimited and Delta guys here, what are the tools that we use that are integral part of how you determine your information? How do you know to go back and develop public policy on what's happening with populations and that kind of stuff? Well, Ed, why don't you give us a little insight on some of the tactics or processes of where we get that scientific information?
Good. That's a great question. And science is the underpinning of everything that we do in waterfowl management. We're unique in that way. I think since 1955, we've been doing aerial waterfowl surveys in the prairies to count wetlands in May and to count breeding pairs. So we have a literal mountain of data from which to try to figure out harvest regulations that support sustainable hunting and sustainable populations. So we've been doing these May surveys for a long time. We've been doing wintering ground surveys. I was involved with them in my days at the Mississippi Department of Wildlife. We are counting ducks on the wintering grounds. We need to do a better job of that, but we're counting ducks there. We're doing endless research projects with radio telemetry, with putting leg bands and neck collars on geese to figure out survival and migration pathways and patterns. We're looking at wintering distribution, whether it's changed or not changed. So we've got a lot of scientific foundation, and that's not to be taken for granted. And we've talked a lot about this throughout tonight and the previous episode. Was this stuff takes investment, and until duck hunters realize the amount of investment and dollars and resources that it takes to manage mallard population on a continental basis, we are going to be in very bad shape. So we've got to know that we need to know what goes on in the breeding grounds, what goes on in the wintering grounds, how ducks migrate and travel through both. And, you know, with that, I would say that in recent years, we've seen the Fish and Wildlife Service and a lot of state wildlife agencies that we support with licensed dollars, that we support with duck stamp dollars, they have not had the resources they need to do science. So when we hear about bag limits changing or not being what they think or what we think they need to be, typically that's because of lack of scientific data. And we've got to continue to collect data. I know that y'all have been involved in a lot of projects looking at a lot of different species, but things change, the landscape changes. We've got to keep monitoring all of that. And I know that a lot of our monumental studies, I'm kind of rambling here, but a lot of our monumental studies were done 25 and 30 years ago. But guess what? The landscape's changed. The rice base has changed. The flooded timber in Arkansas has changed. The prairie potholes have changed. So, and we can talk about a lot of that, but the bottom line is we have to be able to monitor that, and therefore, or subsequently, its impacts on waterfowl populations. So we have to step up our investment in science, just like it was 30 years ago. We can't take that for granted.
And to Ed's point, Ed was kind of generous there in his assessment. I mean, we haven't, guys. I mean, the Fish and Wildlife Service Migratory Bird Program does things like evaluates new pintail harvest strategies, runs a banding program, and runs these surveys. They're, you know, in terms of capacity within the Migratory Bird Program, they're way behind where they were in 2010. You know, I talk to duck hunters all the time and say, man, we just don't shoot the bands that we used to shoot. There's a reason for that, because there isn't somebody putting them out. The banding program.
Is that a funding issue, or is that?
Funding issue. It's a funding issue. And, you know, you look at what happened, you know, two of the most important banding stations in the U.S. prairies, one of which is the most important banding station for northern pintails, being J. Clark Salyer Refuge in Upham, North Dakota, another one being Sand Lake National Wildlife Refuge. We're going to suspend their banding program, because what's happened is the banding program has relied on the refuge staff. The refuge staff has also gone through a huge workforce reduction, and they don't have the people to shoot rocket nets anymore. And they don't have money to put jewelry on ducks. Well, that has, you know, not only do duck hunters like to shoot bands, but understanding what's happening with pintail populations is a pretty important data point if we're going to advocate for change in regulations. And so, you know, when you're dealing with, you know, Ed knows this way better than a poli-sci and philosophy major from a liberal arts school in Minnesota, but when you start having bigger confidence intervals because you don't have the data set, you're in, basically what you do is you stay conservative, and you don't have good information to make good decisions on. And that's the state of where we are, at least with the federal system. And you've got good investment privately happening from the states and the NGOs and some of the rest of that stuff. But our federal monitoring programs, like the banding program, are in tough shape. much like we described the failing water control structure at White Lake in our last session, our banding program is in bad a shape as that leaky water control structure is at White Lake.
I'm glad you're alluding to that, John. I heard a biologist tell me a few weeks ago that I think in essence, if we were to ban 3 times the number of waterfowl that we're currently banning, that we would answer basically all the questions that we're trying to ask right now, that information would come pouring in if we had those resources.
Yeah, I mean, you want to start it. And again, as Ed pointed out, we know more about the mallard duck than almost any other organism on planet Earth, right? He's kind of our white rat, and we've been studying him since the 30s. We know a lot about him, but as Ed points out, things have changed on the landscape. What's the consequences of a poor green tree reservoir resource or lack of post-harvest flooding in Louisiana, or the conversion, the loss of coastal marsh and all those things? We've done a great job of building a basic understanding of these critters most of these critters we're trying to manage. Frankly, we don't know jack about canvasbacks and scaup and ringnecks, frankly, but we need a lot more information, and the only way we're going to get that information is to support the Fish and Wildlife Service to have the resources to actually keep running these programs. I mean, Ed is a guy that was involved with the state agency. It wasn't that long ago where the Fish and Wildlife Service just threw their hands up in the air and said, we don't have money to invest in the midwinter waterfowl surveys anymore, right? I mean, that's an important data point that the Fish and Wildlife Service is not party to. And again, it's not because they don't want to do it. It's because they've been starved out for funding.
And who picks up that slack? It's going to be state wildlife agencies like Mississippi or other states. And those agencies are also dependent on $100 to do that work. So in Mississippi, we use duck stamp dollars to pay for aerial waterfowl surveys. We thought our method was better than what the Fish and Wildlife Service was doing, and it was scientifically justified and so forth. But to your point, somebody's got to pick up that slack. And we're not doing duck banding or aerial surveys just to put it on a weekly waterfowl report or to put it on a duck hunter's lanyard. We're doing these things for scientific reasons to help support continued waterfowl hunting. And if we're worried about hunting in the future, we have to be worried about maintaining our scientific justification and foundation for waterfowl management.
Well said, Ed. Well said.
Yeah, and you talk about funding. That's an issue across the board for the entire United States. And we talked about wetland loss, and we have some documentation of acreages of that. But what's probably not counted is federal refuges and state refuges that are not being managed properly. They're still categorized as wet, but at the end of the day, they're not really functioning for waterfowl habitat. I know, and it's not the biologist's fault, because we know, these guys know what they need to do, but their hands are tied from whether it be burning regulations or spraying regulations. Our local refuge here is, in my opinion, has become more of a tallow tree forest than it has waterfowl habitat. It's just because a lack of funding. So.
Yeah, there's plenty of equipment out there, and I know that we've all seen it, but we've got to have butts in the seat driving those tractors, driving those high boys, spraying tallow trees, spraying other things, killing the stuff that doesn't produce food for ducks. And I've been on calls in South Carolina today. We're seeing WMAs having to shut down to public hunting because the habitat is just not good enough to support waterfowl. So instead of creating this high expectation for duck hunters to go visit, it's a better idea to close them down. Is that great? Hell no, it's not good. It means we as duck hunters in the duck hunting community are not doing what we need to do and putting our money where our mouth is. We've got a long track record of investing in waterfowl. We've got to continue that. And that's our biggest challenge.
And guys, we're talking about pittance, right? I mean, listen, we could talk a long time about federal deficits and, big government, too big a government, too small a government. I don't want to get into a political narrative, but what we're talking about is decimal dust to the federal budget. I mean, Ed, what do we figure we need for, if you and I did an exercise here this spring looking at banding in the migratory bird program? We're talking about $10 million a year.
Yeah.
I mean, $10 million a year, guys, changes the trajectory of our ability to manage waterfowl in this continent. I mean, it won't take us very long to come up with a list of $10 million that the federal government spent stupidly. And so we're not, Ed and I aren't here to blow out, to put our great grandchildren in eternal debt to the Chinese. We're talking about trivial amounts of money, frankly, that the agencies have the authority to spend, and it's become deprioritized over time.
Yeah. So kind of switching gears a little bit, we call this our Corona version of State of Waterfowl because, no one's traveling right now. And we've talked about the hunters not going to Canada because of the borders being closed. And that's all in relation to harvesting. But how has coronavirus affected the survey process and the banding? I'm sure there's been some implications of that. Has biologists from the United States been allowed to go and continue with their work? Where are we at with that?
No. The bottom line is we have not completed our Canadian counts and we haven't completed our U.S. prairie counts. I think the only thing that we have is North Dakota Game and Fish, their annual survey, which contributes to the survey process, but it's just one data point. So the surveys that have happened since 1955 were interrupted this year for the first time.
So we'll actually have a void in the data, and pending we
Well,
can continue this back. There'll be a missing year then.
There will be. And so our decisions about next year's hunting season will actually be based on 2 nesting seasons ago. And listen, nobody should get too terrible worried about that. I think we'll probably forego some opportunity on species like pintail and Atlantic Canada geese and maybe eastern mallards, maybe pintail, but we're not going to doom North American waterfowl by doing that. But, not only did we not count, we didn't send banding crews to Canada. We did not have, the big crews banding Arctic nesting geese like white fronts and snow geese. And I mean, all these data streams that have been as normal as the sun rising in the east and setting in the west is interrupted the entire thing. And so, we're going to have a gray spot in this incredible rich data that we've been collecting and all of us have been dedicated to collecting since 1955. We're going to have a big gray box in a lot of places as a result of this whole COVID experience.
So how is COVID going to affect you guys with fundraising? Obviously, you get your dollars from members that that you actually spend that money doing those great things, and you got to be taking a hit right now as the public backed off of membership dues and donations.
Ed, you want to start from Duck's perspective?
That's a great question, and we've talked a lot about that. Ducks Unlimited has over 1 million supporters and I think about 750,000 members. We have continued memberships during this COVID crisis, so we haven't had any interruptions in memberships. But events across the country are not being attended. In the peak of the pandemic, and I know that we're starting to hit one now. In the peak back in the spring, which is one of our highest seasons, we were shut down, and those fundraising dollars from local DU banquets are the seed dollars from which DU does habitat projects. Then we leverage that with state and federal sources. So So all the policy engagement that we do for public revenue comes from the local committees, the local membership, the local banquets. So without that, we are seeing an impact. Thankfully, we have a lot of generous supporters, and people are still supporting us, but event attendance is definitely down. And we would be remiss to say that it's not having an impact. Thankfully, we adjusted with virtual events and so forth. I mean, we're doing a Zoom podcast right now, and we're doing Zoom auctions and so forth in states where it's legal, but it's definitely having an impact.
And John, likewise with Delta?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, the one thing that helped us a little bit is, you know, if you're at Delta Waterfowl and you're gonna pick a time for a global pandemic 2 weeks into your fiscal year, is a pretty good time for it to have it happen, right? So we could sort of adjust our planning on the fly. But, you know, listen, guys, I mean, we're just like everybody else, you know, and DU and a bunch of our colleagues in the conservation community haven't been immune to any of this stuff, right? There's staff furloughs. I was on furlough for a month. Many of our, almost our entire staff complement went on a rolling furlough. We did our best to cut costs in a way that would not have an impact on our mission and programming. But, you know, there's some pretty remarkable things happening out there. And yet, I think, you look at, uncomfortable situations often breed pretty heroic actions. And I'm sure Ed can string off a number of anecdotes like this too. But, our volunteers in situations where they've been able to hold banquets have held exceptional banquets. And the community's been eager to get out there and support our work. And members have been great. Our donors have been great. We're going to be fine coming out of all this because I think we acted aggressively, and frankly, because of the incredible hard work and generosity of our members and our donors and our volunteers, and those people, it's been pretty inspirational. I mean, we had a banquet in South Louisiana last week that, they had 2 weeks to put it together and raise $50,000. You think about, I mean, the last thing anybody in South Louisiana should have been worried about is sending a check to Delta. I mean, 2 hurricanes, a global pandemic, all the rest of there were a trillion reasons not to do it. But that community came together and did it. And I'm sure it's happening to DU. I'm sure it's happening with Pheasants Forever and everybody else. And it's a credit to the incredible people that are willing to dedicate their time and energy to do that sort of thing. And I mean, it's, you talked about Hillman's Facebook post. I saw it and I had a tear in my eye too. And it's hard for me to look at these volunteers that are dealing with all things they're dealing with. They got people in their communities being laid off and all the crap that we're dealing with COVID, and they just keep pounding it out. It's an incredible inspiration. It makes me really proud to work for the people I work for every day.
Well, with that, I mean, we talked about the culture of waterfowl hunting. I mean, duck hunting is a social sport. It's not like turkey hunting or deer hunting. We like to get together. But I hope that this is a short-lived thing, meaning it only lasts for about a year, and we will get back to normal. And we've got to make sure that, DU, Delta events, other get-togethers, we maintain that tradition. That's a unique tradition to duck hunting. That people who duck hunt care about the resource that they end up shooting a few days a year. They're also contributing to conservation. We are the model for that. If it wasn't for us, we wouldn't have that event-based fundraising model. And I look forward to the day that we can get together, have drinks together instead of talking on a screen and doing it in a duck blind or at a local DU.
Amen to that.
Yeah, and I think, when you look at the waterfowling community, And there's a lot of strong ties with farmers and wetland managers and biologists. You know, it's a resilient group of people. And fortunately, what we do is predominantly outside. It doesn't take large numbers of people to drive a tractor and that kind of stuff. So it looks like habitat's going to continue to be managed. And, hopefully we can, John had made a great point, the fact that ducks have wings and they're going to move and they're going to go where they feel like they need to go. And so habitat's a huge driver. While we're talking about habitat, won't you guys, do y'all have a quick recap of your area? I know y'all cover big areas, but let's talk what's going on with habitat water-wise. Any predictions for the remainder of this year? John, you were talking earlier about your part of the world has already froze up. What's happening in North Dakota today?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's amazing. We've had a really screwy fall. You know, as I mentioned earlier, we had, on the previous episode, we had incredible wetland conditions going into spring. We attracted a pile of ducks. I wish we would have had a survey, because I think it would have been mind-boggling for people to see how many breeding ducks the U.S. prairies soaked up this year, especially stuff like pintails and blue-winged teal and gadwall. But, you know, it's interesting, as wet as we were in the spring, and I think we had really good productions we talked about on the previous episode, we got real dry. And you know, we went from, you know, my favorite marsh is a public marsh about 25 minutes from my house. And that particular marsh dropped 2.5 feet from the 1st of August to the day I scouted it, the day before our opener, and to the point where I couldn't, you know, I guess I could have, if I was in better shape. If I was like Jimbo, I probably could have got in there and mucked around. But, you know, it really had, I think that, you know, having those wet conditions and dry conditions was kind of screwy for our duck season. And then we had a hellacious freeze in mid-October that I think guys like Cation and Jimbo were delighted to see, because we shoved a pile of ducks south quite a bit earlier than we normally do. And you can see that in the surveys. You could see a big spike in the Illinois River survey. In some of the early surveys that were done, we just shoved a lot of ducks out of here. And then we got another big freeze last week here, right before Veterans Day. Got really brutal. The interesting thing about the first freeze is we were colder than Saskatchewan was. But then Saskatchewan finally had a real brutal cold front, big snow last week. And unfortunately, we had lost so much of our duck population, sent them down the road to you all, that when we got that big pulse out of Saskatchewan, I don't think we benefited from it as much. So we're just chipping away really on a few ducks that are holed up on big water in the Missouri River, and we're going to have to chip away at those to sort of grind out the rest of our duck season. I recognize nobody south of Mason-Dixon line is going to cry about a guy in North Dakota not shooting ducks in November, but I'm going to cry about it. But the thing that's got me worried, guys, is it's bad dry up here right now. And, you know, obviously we got lots of time between now and when the first pintails get back. But, you know, that great habitat that we had in South Dakota and North Dakota, and all those little itty bitty temporary and seasonal wetlands being full of water, that's a thing of the past. And Saskatchewan has not gotten crazy wet in the interim. So we need some good things to happen between now and next March to set the table for another good year of production.
Ed, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, Doug, I'll let you talk about South Louisiana, but I've heard good reports from both coastal Texas, from Oklahoma, from the rest of Louisiana. I think y'all opened up last weekend. I was in Arkansas last weekend, saw a lot of ducks, saw a pile of white geese and white-fronted geese, saw a surprising number of ducks, but it's dry. I think the weather pattern is still very, very dry. And it doesn't seem like we're changing from that. Mississippi, this time of year, we're always bone dry. Talked to some folks in South Carolina and the East Coast earlier today. They're also in pretty tough shape. They're not seeing a lot of ducks yet. So we need some good cold fronts. John, I hope you freeze harder than anything that you've ever seen.
And snow that deep.
Yeah,
No deeper than you, John.
that's not that much snow, Ed.
Well, you've got a lot of horses, I hear. You can ride out if you need to. But this time of year, we always see a push around Halloween. We have enough ducks for opening week, and then it slows down. I don't think this year is going to be any different. And Lord willing, we'll have some rain to get some backwater flooding in some places in Arkansas and flood up some rice and bean fields, and we'll have fun. But we've done all we can do.
Yeah, and we were devastated by 2 large hurricanes and who knows how many tropical storms. We done lost count this year in Louisiana. And long term, not great issues with coastal erosion and all that. But from duck management, we opened a lot of big areas of marsh up, and we got a lot of dead, decaying grass. It's going to create a lot of invertebrates. So even though we may have lost a lot of weed grass, I think a lot of that's going to be offset by big areas of mud flats. And we're already seeing those birds as the water goes down, starting to pile up in some of those areas and key in on invertebrates. Also, due to wind damage, a lot of our farmers are probably not going to harvest their second crop this year. So I think even though we've had some big impacts this year from a duck habitat standpoint, I don't think we're going to be devastated here in Louisiana. So we'll be anxious to see how that plays out. I know we're kind of winding down in our conversation here, and we've been asking you guys some questions, but let me give each of y'all an opportunity to maybe say something you wanted to say or have some closing comments. And Ed, won't you start off and just kind of, we want to thank you guys for being here, and this has been tremendous to get the 2 organizations together and talk about the resource and what we can do as waterfowlers to come together for one good common goal. And so, Ed, won't you just give us some of your closing comments?
I would start by saying, when are y'all coming to DC with me? Are you going to come in the spring after we get a COVID vaccine? Are we going to go in the fall? Because I can't voice strongly enough how important it is for y'all to tell your elected officials how much this stuff means to you personally and to your business. Y'all wouldn't be in this business if you didn't care about it. I am extremely fortunate to work for Ducks Unlimited and to talk about ducks for a living. But there's nothing I love more than taking hunters and others who care about ducks and wetlands, talk to their elected officials about this stuff. It's extremely meaningful to me, but it doesn't have to happen in DC. It can happen in Jonesboro, Arkansas. It can happen in Ada, Oklahoma. It can happen in Beaumont, Texas. Wherever we live, we can have these experiences. And I encourage us all to do that, to get involved in waterfowl conservation policy, because again, it's not guaranteed. Regardless of who's in the White House or who's in Congress, it's not guaranteed. And I'm thankful to get to work with folks like John, work with folks at DU, see the work that we do on the ground for ducks and duck hunters. Because guys, regardless of what we might think, we can't take it for granted, and there's really only a few of us, and I mean that in the biggest sense. There's only a few of us that are actually doing this work. So I encourage you to speak with your own voice, to support us, and to continue taking care of the resource that we love.
Well, a huge thank you to you guys that do go to DC, because I had the opportunity to do that, and I would much rather my camouflage jacket than my suit and tie any day of the week. So kudos for you guys for what you do up there. It's quite an education for someone, and as you said, I would encourage anybody, if you have the opportunity, to go see our government at work. It is a unique experience. So thank you for all the hard work and time y'all put in up there. John, you want to give us some of your last closing comments?
Yeah, I mean, it's, Ed's a professionally trained biologist, and I kid him about it all the time. He's, one of those many seed counters from Mississippi State. And, I just, my introduction to waterfowl hunting, 100% from the duck hunter's perspective. I had no professional experience in this when I joined Delta in 1998. Maybe Delta should reconsider that. But as a 4-year-old, my dad put me on his back and humped me into a little marsh outside of St. Paul, told me not to step on cow pies, and threw a burlap sack over me and told me to shut up. Now, from that first experience, I am where I am today in terms of this incredible passion for this resource. I don't know, and listen, Ed and I wear suits and go to meetings with congressmen and senators and director of Fish and Wildlife Service. I guarantee you, Ed Penny and I are the exact same guy as it is listening to this podcast. We've just been afforded the opportunity from a wide array of circumstances to get to work for ducks and duck hunters. But the same passion all you guys have and all your listeners have for this resource is the thing that gets Ed and I out of bed every morning. It's gotten us to work together collaboratively the way we have the last number of years. And frankly, it's allowed us to have some incredible successes. And don't ever underestimate the importance of that personal passion and commitment, because nobody's ever going to accuse me of being the smartest guy. Nobody's ever going to accuse me of being the tallest guy. But it's that passion and commitment that I know that we share with so many of your listeners that can make a huge difference. If we, just like Delta and DU setting some organizational differences aside to work together on these priorities, if duck hunters would commit themselves in the most modest of ways to these issues that are so important, they can make the world a hell of a lot better place. And if we left anybody with anything out of these last 2 episodes, I hope that's really apparent.
Well, speaking of passionate and convicted, I can't think any more convicted and passionate about conversation and Kaysen over there in Hunter, Arkansas. Kaysen, you got any last closing comments for us?
Well, I just think it's refreshing to get everybody here talking about the same thing. To John's point about his dad taking him, I think that's the thing that we need to kind of harken back to, is how you got into sport, what drives you, what motivates you. And when we all realize that it's a resource that we have to manage, but when that passion comes to the surface and we start taking care of the resource, then we're all going to go in the right direction. We're all going to benefit from that.
Well, we saved the best for last. So, Jimbo, you want to tell us your last thoughts?
I don't know that I can add anything to it that these other gentlemen haven't already added to it. Knowing where we come from is a big part of knowing where we're going. And sometimes you got to look behind you to see forward. And I think as long as we keep the resource first, think about the importance of God, family, and ducks, and not necessarily in that order, and just keep on keeping on, I think we're going to be all right.
Well, I know from Gros Savant's standpoint, it's been a privilege to be part of this conversation. And again, I got to thank the guys from Xpress Boat for hosting this platform. This has been a tremendous opportunity, and can't remember if it's ever happened having Ducks Unlimited and Delta together on the same podcast to to sit and talk about the state of waterfowl and just talk about the unity of waterfowlers and how much really we do together. And so if we can put all our differences aside, and whether you would rather focus on being a member of one or the other is irrelevant at this point. As we've said multiple times throughout these two podcasts, it's all about managing the resource. And at the end of the day, we want to do what we can do that's going to promote ducks. And so we thank all of you guys for being here, and we thank all of our listeners out there. So don't forget to share this podcast with everybody. And if you didn't get a chance to listen to part 1, you need to go back and listen to that, because it really ties in to a great conversation about a lot of topics that most people don't think about. So wishing everyone out there a continued happy hunting season, and hope you all continue watching Xpress Outdoors. Thank you all again, and we'll see you at our next episode.